I'm Tony Katzer, the CEO of the IAB Tech Lab. We've teamed up with Marketecture to celebrate the Tech Lab's 10th anniversary by highlighting some of its most impactful work and the dedicated members who make it all possible. Please join us in celebrating our 10th anniversary at Tech Lab Summit on June 11th and 12th in New York City, where we will be discussing the future of these standards and more topics, including artificial intelligence, the future of privacy, connected television, cross-environment measurement, and so much more. We hope you enjoy this series and look forward to the next 10 years.
Welcome to Marketecture, where you can get smart fast with in-depth interviews of leading technology executives. This is one in a series of interviews conducted in partnership with the IAB Tech Lab to celebrate that organization's 10th anniversary. In these interviews, we learn about the history and impact of some of the Tech Lab's most impactful work. I'm Ari Paparo, and today I'm here with Julia Shullman, who is the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer for Telly. Julia, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we have you here to discuss everyone's favorite IAB standard. I'm going to say that in all the interviews. The Transparency and Consent Framework, affectionately known as TCF. So why don't we just get started? What does TCF do?
Yeah. So it's a really simple standard that allows everyone across the digital ad ecosystem to comply with two of the main requirements of GDPR and ePrivacy, so the European regulations. It enables parties to handle transparency requirements and user choice requirements. And let me just talk you through like three main buckets.
Yep.
It allows people to standardize the way they provide users disclosures about the vendors that are being used behind the scenes to power advertising. It gives users choice around those vendors. It enables the publishers and vendors to signal among themselves what users have chosen among those vendors. And then the last thing, which isn't technically required under the regulations, but was something we can talk about maybe a little bit later, is it actually gives publishers control over which vendors are actually able to collect, use, and share data off of their various digital properties.
Right. So that's a lot. So basically, you're the one responsible for all the cookie banners. Is that what you tell your friends?
I mean, yeah, unfortunately. Yep.
All right. So let's walk through what problems this was solving. And I want to kind of go back to the origination of the conversations around creating the standard. So if you had not created the standard, what problems were there going to be, or were there?
So there were three big problems when I kind of thought back to what was going on back in the day. So 2016, GDPR was passed. And so from a regulatory perspective, all of us were looking at that regulation, looking at the giant fines that they were enabling under the regulation, and actually looking at requirements and trying to figure out how we were all going to meet those requirements. So that was one thing. And then another big thing that was going on that is all over the press and has remained all over the press is people were starting to wake up to the clash between privacy and antitrust, clash between privacy and competition. And they looked at GDPR and they looked at ePrivacy, and they saw that this was unfortunately kind of another notch in that belt of competition winning out over privacy.
Right. So by competition, you're talking about big companies like the Googles of the world being able to kind of control the consumer behavior versus independents?
Yeah. So when all of us looked at the requirements, and by the way, those requirements were nothing new. They'd been on the books for 20 years prior to GDPR passing. There just wasn't much teeth to them. So, a lot of times you guys are already seeing cookie banners in Europe. Those had already existed pre-2016 and pre-GDPR. They just weren't as sophisticated. But when we looked at those requirements and really breaking it down, it requires that a publisher, any digital property that you go to, is required to show you the vendors that they're using behind the scenes, show you the way those vendors are using data, so purposes. They're required to provide an actual active signal to those vendors about what users consented to or not. And then all the vendors are supposed to be able to prove that anytime they basically touch data, they had the right approvals to use that. So if you look at those requirements, and then you look at some of the walled gardens, and I'm just going to pick on Google because they're unfortunately the easiest to pick on, but they didn't design this. They have a publisher ad server, they have an SSP, they have a DSP, they have a DMP, they've got all these other technologies that have come about, privacy enhancing technologies, you name it. And so they actually could look at this requirement and say, we can actually just do this. Like, we can build our own cookie banner, we can build the technology the publisher reviewed for it. And frankly, no data needs to leave our walls. And so it's pretty easy for publishers to use our stack to comply with this requirement. The rest of us who were in the open ecosystem at the time, I was working at AppNexus. which was generally an SSP. DSP was actually entering the market in Europe with a competing ad server. We looked at this and said, oh dear, we're going to have to share data across the ecosystem. Our clients are still going to need to rely on third-party demand because we don't have a monster DSP. You were running one of the DSPs at the time. And we were also deep into pushing out header bidding.
Right.
And so between our header bidding SSP offering and our ad server offering, and being able to even walk in to large publishers in Europe and pitch our offering and work with them and convince them to use our platform, we had to have a solution for this. And we recognized after much debate, and much conversation about whether we should try to build something proprietary or work with the ecosystem, we realized, frankly, we had two years to do this. There was no way we were going to be able to build a full stack solution in that time. And everyone knows how hard it is to do that. So we knew we had to kind of go out and rally people to work on a standard. And many other companies were starting to come to the exact same determination on their own.
Right. I want to go into the story of how we created this, but before I do, I just want to go back on some things that you had said. So a lot of people don't realize that ePrivacy, I say it the European way, ePrivacy predates GDPR, and ePrivacy was really the start of the dreaded cookie banners because in layman's terms, it required some level of consent before data was stored on your browser. So with ePrivacy, I guess there was sort of a pretty limited requirement. You just had to, get consent and then store it somewhere. But with GDPR, the big step change was this requirement that all of your vendors sort of waterfall down that consent. And tell me if anything I'm saying doesn't match your understanding.
No, the one thing I would just flag is, believe it or not, that the waterfall vendor requirement technically had been on the books since 1996. But it was just a directive that no one actually enforced.
Interesting.
So it was really the fines. And frankly, it was regulators putting into the preamble of the GDPR and behind the scenes starting investigations and starting conversations with large publishers and ad tech companies that kind of collectively, we all realized we were a 100% a target of theirs, and we had to clean up our act before GDPR hit.
Right. And so if I put on my sort of engineering hat and I said, well, if this spec didn't exist and every independent publisher and ad server had their own spec, as a vendor like a DSP, you would have to support, 10, 50, 100 different ways in which your upstream partners were telling you had or did not have consent, right?
Yeah, it would have been an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
So when we go in and you talk to your management team and you talk to your engineering leaders and explain this to them, all of them were like, what do we need to do to help out? Because we 100% do not want to have to support dozens, if not, more hundreds of standards.
Exactly. Okay. So let's go back in time. So you're at AppNexus. What was your role there at the time?
So when it first kicked off, I was the lead attorney for the publisher technology group. Okay. So working on header bidding and all that. But then I actually, during this phase, took over privacy and took on the chief privacy counsel role.
Okay. Tough job. So was this your idea or did the idea come to many people at once?
It was definitely not my sole idea. The idea kind of collectively grew as a number of us were sort of sitting around industry tables and having these conversations. So, throwing out some names, it was a combination of folks at IAB Europe, particularly Matthias Matheson, who's now in the privacy team at TripleLift, folks over at Seismic, folks at Quantcast, folks at Yahoo, and folks at MediaMath. That was kind of the core group of policy folks and engineering groups that really worked together on both the policy and the actual technical spec.
And did it immediately go to the IAB Tech Lab, or was there some germination before that?
It wasn't. There was definitely germination because it started in Europe and it started at European policy tables. And we kind of all knew that it probably best sat at IAB Europe from a policy perspective, but there is no tech incubator. There really is no tech standards setting group for the ad ecosystem in Europe.
Right.
And so we knocked on Tech Lab's door at the time. Dennis Buckheim, was leading Tech Lab, and we actually invited him into AppNexus's office and sat up on the 6th floor, I want to say, in a conference room and explained to him what was going on and tried to convince him it was the right thing to do.
It would be a better story if you played one-on-one with him in the basketball court and the winner got to determine the standard.
I mean, we could also say we did that and he ate candy out of our candy bar and all that other stuff.
We're not fact-checking this podcast. You can say whatever you want.
It was like a free throw competition. He was like, if I win, I don't have to take on the standard. You're gonna start some new standard setting body. And if I lose, I guess we'll take it on.
Then O'Kelly dunked and the standard was born.
Yeah, and that was it.
Okay,
yeah.
No, back to facts. Let's go back to facts. It's an interesting side note that the IAB is a per country organization. IAB Europe and IAB US have a relationship, but they're not the same entity. Okay, so you start this process. You have the members of this kind of committee. And what was it like? First of all, were you under the shadow of GDPR enforcement? Was there kind of a deadline here?
There absolutely is a deadline, May 25th, 2018. I don't think I'll ever forget that date. We started the conversations back in kind of late 16. 17 was a year of really ideating. And the biggest challenges we faced were, number one, absolutely at the top of that list was competing commercial and strategic incentives of companies. And I can get into that in a bit. We sort of touched on it already. Number two was just disagreement around legal requirements and what was and wasn't required. And then also strategy around how to actually meet those requirements, whether to try to get them all kind of upfront or honestly kind of build something that was good enough and negotiate with regulators in the industry. And then the last one, which you touched on, from an engineering and a policy perspective, it's never easy to design standards that require absolute coordination between engineering teams, legal and policy teams, because there's some saying, I think, that engineers are from Mars and lawyers are from Venus or something like that. But there's so much talking over each other and miscommunication. So you kind of put all those things together, and we had a really tough time convincing the entire ecosystem this was something that was necessary,
right?
That it was something that they should support, something they should deploy, and then a really tough time convincing the industry associations that IAB Europe and Tech Lab are the right places for them to go. I won't get into the details there, but industry politics. And then really brutal kind of throw down conversations and disagreements among different companies because of their commercial and strategic interests, and between engineers and legal folks.
Okay.
So it was it was a long 2 years.
I want to hear some details about this stuff. You don't have to name names, but could you characterize, let's just say, the policy disagreements to start? What were the range of opinions on a policy legal perspective?
Yeah, so I'll say probably three big things. I mean, one was just how complex to make the standard. I don't know how much, and my apologies if you've had to look into the standard too much, but we started off pretty simple,
right? And
sort of like anyone said, we can't build to every single nitty gritty interpretation of this thing. No one's going to support it. So major disagreements about, how many purposes to enable. So standardizing the use cases for data, that's always a debate. Major disagreements about whether all vendors would be opted in by default or whether publishers had to light up all vendors. And that is not just a legal conversation. That's a commercial strategic decision about how many vendors in the ecosystem are going to be lit up by default on a publisher's page. And then, kind of nonsense around the edges of how to actually handle CMPs. So the actual cookie banners, the tech that enables them, what they had to do, what had to be shown on the first layer of a banner versus the second layer of a banner. Those are the big ones.
Well, it's interesting. I was about to bring that sort of stuff up, but the standard kind of ends at some point. There's a limit. It doesn't prescribe, unless I'm misunderstanding it, how those cookie banners need to look in a lot of detail. And that was a decision.
That's purposeful.
Yeah.
That was absolutely a decision because, there were people who said, let's just build a standardized consent management platform. For a long time in the spec, there was no place for a CMP. There was going to be one industry layer that would just be built into an ad server or your initial, tag that lit up your SSPs or whatever. And publishers wouldn't have it. They wanted to control the communication with their users, which makes sense. And so we prescribed at a very high level sort of what information had to be communicated on the first layer of a banner. And I can't believe, how much time people spend on this nonsense, but first layer of a banner versus the second and third. And then how you communicated that from your privacy policy.
Right. And that's where you have natural disagreements between some publishers who might want to light up everyone by default and others who might want to be more conservative.
Right.
What about the technical issues? Where were the technical fault lines?
I mean, the technical fault lines were actually, there was a big debate early on whether this should just be an ads.txt type file that sat on a publisher page or not, because your head probably went there.
Yeah.
The easiest, just stick a file.
That sounds easier.
On site, and everyone will just query it on a regular basis, everyone does. And yeah, there's going to be some mismatch, maybe a couple hours or a day here and there where They don't totally sync up, but why should we have to do this in real time? And people kind of nudged around the edges and talked to regulators about it because this was a big thing. And it became pretty clear that, they were not okay with that. Oh, we'll just bring down consents on a daily or weekly basis.
Right. It has to be per impression, effectively.
Per impression.
Which is really dumb, but that's my editorial point of view.
Yeah. And then how many purposes? Just think about how much information needs to be conveyed in this payload. And there was definitely debate about decreasing that amount of information and complexity because no one really wants to have to actually look at that when it hits a system.
Right. Who came up with the string, the TCF string?
The string was a combination of various engineers and policy folks. So again, it was that kind of core group. Definitely the Quantcast team, Yahoo team, the AppNexus team, the Media Math team. That was really the team that came up with it.
Right. And then what about the idea of having the central registry of vendors? Was that controversial?
I think once people realized that this is going to need to be real time and we're going to need to signal it, it wasn't very controversial. It was just, honestly was a good forcing factor for companies to sign up to this thing because we can talk about, how long it took for this to marinate and take off. But people were a little bit shamed into joining this thing because they realized there was going to be a public registry of vendors and they might not be on there.
Yeah. I think I was one of the first registrants. Beeswax has ID number 3 or something in the registry. So let's talk about it. When it was released for comment and then it was released for production, what was the feedback?
So it was initially released for comment pretty late. And I was kind of trying to figure out through my notes, but I've gone through 3 jobs since then. I think it was maybe February or March of 18, which was not that much time. We gave the usual 30-day comment period. And in non-shocking news, like many standards that are controversial, it got slammed. Everyone and their mother and the usual suspects of people who never came to the table, who weren't paying attention, who didn't really understand ad tech, didn't understand how data flows work and how our technology functions, and then just fundamentally disagreed with it. So that was the initial thing. And then the other big one continued to be just publishers and support for this. There really was a fundamental misunderstanding of how ad tech pipes operate and what that meant for the requirements as most people understood them. I think the last thing, which is interesting and not shocking, but various privacy tech vendors that kind of swung up in the lead up to GDPR were kind of creating FUD around it and claiming that they had better solutions, which makes me laugh because there's absolutely no way that they had a solution that enabled RTB as it exists today.
Yeah. It's one thing to be able to have tech that integrates onto a publisher page. It's a totally different thing to be able to get adoption through hundreds of vendors downstream from that. So notably, I think Google did not adopt this, so they built their own solution.
Yeah, so initially they did. They built their own solution. And I think they're always stuck in a tough position. I will absolutely give them that, where they don't want to be seen as driving a solution because they don't want to be seen as moving a market or potentially moving it in a way that favors them. And then frankly, this was more complex than they needed to support. So they really didn't want to get involved, but they were at the table. Like usual, they had folks kind of participating and watching what was going on and weighing in every once in a while. And very quietly and, throughout the whole process, there certainly was a lot of pressure on them to adopt it. So they actually announced, I want to say either on GDPR D-Day, as we call it, May 25th, 2018, or the next day, they announced that they were adopting it because there was a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah, I think their point of view, if I recall, was that they didn't have nearly enough time to adopt it for the May deadline. They had their own thing cooking, and then they announced they were going to adopt it, and then it probably took another year before they did.
Yeah, and I think, they very publicly kind of also, I think when they launched their own consent standard, it was brilliant. They announced that publishers were only going to be able to get consent for a limited number of vendors. I can't remember.
It was very small.
Something laughable. It was 8 vendors, which just, you laugh, right? What was that? An ad server, them, and a handful of SSPs and DSPs, which just doesn't cut it. Nothing else, no DMPs, et cetera. But my assumption, without knowing specifically, is they were getting pressure from regulators because many publishers were getting pressure from regulators that consent wouldn't be valid for dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of vendors on any given ad request. So Google was like, you guys figure this out, you fight your battle. And if you got a standard that people align on, that people rally behind, that people very publicly claim is the only thing that's going to enable them to be compliant with these requirements, of course we'll get behind it.
Right. And this has actually turned out to be one of the most controversial, if not the only controversial standard the IAB's ever put out. So this standard, maybe you could just walk me through the legal challenges. They've been sued. I think there's one regulator who says the IAB is a controller because it created the standard. Mm-hmm. And there's been numerous lawsuits to just make the standard invalid in various jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could give us kind of a quick overview of that.
Yeah. There's two flavors of litigants that are out there or regulators that are kind of coming after the standard. There's folks that went after either big publishers or big ad tech vendors. And they make the arguments that I've kind of flagged already, which is consumers can't consent to hundreds, if not thousands of vendors processing their data behind the scenes. They're always sort of picking around the edges of whether the purposes, like the way that we use data is clear, whether the CMP has like dark patterns. So has the user been nudged into being forced to consent? Do publishers offer other ways to use their solutions? That's sort of the one flavor. The other really interesting flavor is this case against IAB Europe. And so I think the folks behind the scenes, tend to be Max Schrems and a bunch of pretty famous kind of privacy activists, said, we'll go after the standards setting body. And to your point, we're gonna say that, they have to be a joint controller. So they're responsible for the standard and for everyone that's using that standard, which is kind of nuts. Like IAB Europe now as a nonprofit that is just trying to facilitate a standard that all of its members aligned on is now responsible for its members' use of that standard and use of this data, which you think about all these ad tech parties and all these publishers, potential billions of dollars in fines, which is just bananas. So, IAB Europe has hired the best law firms, hired the best advisors, has done a very good job kind of making it clear that they are not directing traffic around the standard. And they've taken it up to the equivalent of the European Supreme Court, the ECJ, and they got actually fairly favorable ruling, which wasn't really that clear in the press, but the ECJ said, yeah, you're a controller, but you're like a very narrow one. Mm-hmm. And so as long as you do a couple things, like you're not going to be responsible for all this stuff. So now they go back to the local Belgian court where they're located and they try to kind of finalize it.
Right.
But I think the big thing is all these privacy activists and, more power to them. They're trying to argue that users can't understand and they can't agree to the hundreds, if not thousands of various vendors behind the scenes using their data on those users cross-site, which is a fair argument.
It is.
And that's something that's going to play out in the US as well. So we'll see how that goes. But that was sort of why we all created the standard in the first place.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting point. If the courts were to say that, basically the sharing of information across many, many vendors itself is illegal or not worthy of consent, then the standard could evolve.
OpenRTB has to evolve. This is the big conversation of, I think you've written about this. It's not even just privacy. It's like, this is maybe an inefficient way of everyone accessing and sharing information. It should maybe move to, clean rooms, privacy enhancing technologies, a combination of publishers and SSPs controlling data, not sharing it. So it's a much bigger conversation that falls outside of just privacy.
Yeah. Okay, but given that, I ask you to characterize the adoption of this standard as extremely widespread.
I actually surveyed a couple of SSPs behind the scenes over the weekend that shall remain nameless, and they said pretty much for display inventory, it's about 100% adoption.
In Europe.
Yeah, in Europe. And then, mobile and CTV certainly are kind of not there yet. Mobile just always argued that they were special flowers. And I think people just kind of threw up their hands. And obviously it works differently and there aren't as many vendors involved usually. And then CTV, that's a whole other can of worms we'll get into another day.
Yeah, the mobile folks just pretend privacy laws don't exist. I remember I once asked one of the big mobile exchanges, a big one, to give us consent, and they literally just put our name at the bottom of their privacy policy, and it said, Beeswax has consent, and they thought that was sufficient. It was madness, but they haven't had any lawsuits. Funny. So the standard has evolved. It's been 5 years, 6 years, whatever. I'm losing count. How has it changed?
Yeah. And I'll say first things first, and you probably won't be shocked by this. Post 2018, I definitely took a step back and was not as heavily involved because honestly, it was exhausting.
I know.
Working on a standard like this, but it was a great experience. But it has evolved, and I've kept one eyeball on it. And there's been amazing teams that have kind of kept shepherding it through and taking it over. It's become not shockingly more complex because more lawyers have come to the table, and as some of these some of these investigations and things roll out, people have had to make updates to it. And now that there's just more cooks in the kitchen, there's better documentation. So I would say, number one, more complex, but number two, better documentation and better awareness of the standard. And I would go so far as to say, frankly, it forced much better awareness across most constituents in the ad tech ecosystem of how ad tech actually works and how personal data, cookies, ad IDs, you name it, is accessed and shared across the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think one thing to note is that the initial adoption after GDPR became the law was on the publisher side. Obviously, publishers had this consent framework, and then they were passing the strings to the exchanges. But it took a while before the DSPs and ad servers were fully compliant. And then there's another level, which is creative vendors, data vendors, all the add-ons and little things that show up on the page. And every one of them needs to be in the consent string. Right.
Yeah. And advertisers, right? Like retail providers and advertisers who just kind of never really thought that the various vendors they enabled on their own pages were controllers and had to manage this or were storing information, on their browser.
Conversion
so
pixels.
Much broader adoption. Yeah. Just a basic conversion pixel or just their own ad server. So yeah, very, very widespread adoption. I think I remember kind of sitting in a conference room on May 25th. We called it the War Room over at AppNexus, and we were kind of watching the metrics across the ecosystem. And adoption was like 4% or something nuts. And now to go from that to 100% in 5 years is pretty crazy.
It is. Okay, so last question. If the TCF was an animal, what animal would it be?
Oh my goodness. An octopus. It's got its tentacles like across the whole ecosystem and no one really totally understands it, but its tentacles are everywhere, so you kind of can't get away from it at this point.
Yeah, I could see the image for this post is definitely going to be created by ChatGPT, and it's going to be an octopus whose tentacles are strings of digits and letters. All right, Julia, thank you so much for taking us through. That was super interesting about transparency and consent framework, TCF, and this is one in a series from the IAB. So again, Julia, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ari.
Thanks for listening. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.